Welcome back to the Research Finance Education Series. This video will explain the process for payments made to non-residents of Canada and the applicable withholding tax. First, why is it important? Section 105 of the Income Tax Regulations requires a withholding tax for payments to non-residents in respect to services rendered in Canada. Unity Health Toronto is paying the withholding tax on behalf of the non-resident and will submit the withholding tax to the Receiver General. A withholding tax of 15% is applied to payments issued to corporations and individuals who are non-residents of Canada, with services rendered in Canada. There is an exception on the first $5,000 Canadian paid to an individual who is a non-resident of Canada, but provided a service in Canada in a calendar year. This does not apply to corporations. The rate is 10%. Before we jump into the different scenarios, the following are some frequently asked questions. Question 1. What if the person or corporation performed the work remotely from the US? Unity Health Toronto is not required to self-assess additional HST on services rendered with the invoice billed, and will pay the value on the invoice. Question 2. What if the non-resident performed the work remotely and is a non-US or Canadian resident, i.e. from Europe, South America, Africa, Asia, etc.? No withholding tax or HST is applied to the payment. Question 3. A staff member presented $1,000 USD to a speaker who is also a US resident. How does the staff member get reimbursed? Finance will charge the corresponding withholding tax value to the mentioned activity. In future instances, an honorarium or payment for services should be processed by accounts payable to ensure all international tax requirements are adhered to. We will now go over scenarios for payments to individuals who are non-residents. Scenario A. Conference speaker honorarium, budget of $500 paid to a non-resident individual. Annual amount has not yet exceeded $5,000 in a calendar year. In this instance, you would take the $500 and multiply it by 10% to calculate the withholding tax. Because the max budget for the honorarium is $500, the payment to the speaker will be $450, while the payment to the CRA will be $50. Scenario B. Conference speaker honorarium of $500 paid to a non-resident individual, where the department wants the payment to the individual to be $500. Annual amount has not yet exceeded $5,000 in a calendar year. In this instance, we would multiply $500 by 10% because it is less than the $5,000 annual amount. We would then divide it by 90% to get the withholding tax value. At the end of the day, the payment to the speaker is $500 and the payment to the CRA is $55. Scenario C. Conference speaker honorarium of $500 paid to a non-resident individual. Annual amount exceeds $5,000 in a calendar year. In this example, we would take the $500 max that we can pay for this honorarium and multiply it by 15% because the annual amount exceeds $5,000 in a calendar year. At the end of the day, the payment to the speaker will be $425. The payment to the CRA will be $75. The total expense to the activity is $500. Scenario D. Conference speaker honorarium of $500 paid to a non-resident individual, where the department wants the payment to the individual to be $500. Annual amount exceeds $5,000 in the calendar year. In this example, we would take the $500 and multiply it by 15% and divide by 85% to get the withholding tax. At the end of the day, the payment to speaker will be $500. The payment to the CRA will be $88.24. Total expense to the activity, $588.24. Scenario E. Conference speaker honorarium of $6,000 paid to a non-resident individual. This is their first payment. To calculate this, you will need to break out the payment in two pieces. First, the first $5,000 will be subject to 10% withholding tax. The next $1,000 will be subject to 15% withholding tax. Because the max budget for this honorarium is $6,000, the payment to the speaker will be $5,350. The payment to the CRA will be $650. Total expense to the activity will be $6,000. Scenario F. Conference speaker honorarium of $6,000 paid to a non-resident individual. This is their first payment. The department wants the speaker to receive $6,000. For this example, like scenario E, you will need to separate the payment into two pieces. First, the first $5,000 will be subject to 10% withholding tax, and you will also divide it by 90% to get that portion of the withholding tax. For the remaining $1,000, you will multiply it by 15% and divide it by 85% to get that portion's corresponding withholding tax. Because the department wants to pay the speaker $6,000 square, the payment to the speaker will be $6,000. The payment to the CRA will be $732.03. Total expense to the activity will be $6,732.03. Scenario G. Conference speaker honorarium of $2,000 paid to a non-resident individual. Cumulative previous payments total $4,000. In this example, the first $1,000 is still below $5,000 and is subject to 10% withholding tax. The remaining $1,000 is over the $5,000 threshold and is subject to 15% withholding tax. Because the max budget for this honorarium is $2,000, the payment to the speaker will be $1,750 and the payment to the CRA is $250. Total expense to the activity is $2,000. Scenario H. Conference speaker honorarium of $2,000 paid to a non-resident individual. Cumulative previous payments total $4,000. The department wants the speaker to receive $2,000. We first need to break this honorarium or payment into two pieces. The first $1,000 is subject to 10% withholding tax, and the second $1,000 is subject to 15%. Because the department wishes to pay the speaker $2,000 flat, the payment to the speaker is $2,000, and then the payment to the CRA is $287.58. Total expense to the activity is $2,287.58. The remaining two scenarios will be focusing on payments to corporations. Scenario I. Payment to a non-resident corporation for $10,000 for support services provided in Canada. Because this is a corporation, the $10,000 is subject to 15% withholding tax. Also, because the max budget for this payment is $10,000, the payment to the speaker or corporation is $8,500. Payment to the CRA is $1,500. Total expense to the activity is $10,000. Scenario J. Payment to a non-resident corporation for $10,000 for support services or honorarium provided in Canada, where they are requiring by contract that they get paid the full amount, regardless of withholding tax. In this example, you would multiply the $10,000 by 15% withholding tax and dividing it by 85% to get the withholding tax. Bottom line, the payment to the speaker is $10,000. Payment to the CRA is $1,764.71. Total expense to the activity is $11,764.71. This Excel file was created to help users calculate the withholding tax value. You would first enter the budget for the honorarium or invoice. In this example, I will put $500. You can enter the currency. In this example, I will put Canadian dollars. In this cell, the question is there intention to pay the value in cell C2 to the recipient? In this example, I wish to pay the recipient $500. The next question is asking if the recipient will receive or have received more than $5,000 in a calendar year. If the answer is no, you can put the value here. If the answer is yes, then you want to enter the value in this cell. The calculations here will tell you how much the recipient will receive, how much the CRA will receive, and total expense to the activity. As another example, you can set the amount to $6,000. Mention here, do you wish to have the recipient receive the full $6,000? Yes. Annual honorarium less than $5,000? Yes or no? The answer is no. You can put $5,000 and then $1,000 to help calculate the withholding tax. This box here tells you how much the recipient will receive, how much the CRA will receive, and how much will be charged to the research activity. All calculations from our previous scenarios are detailed in this tab here. If you have any questions about this presentation, please contact your research financial analyst or researchfinance@smh.ca. Thanks for watching.